Hello and welcome to the Hindu's Parley podcast. And I'm your host, Kallol Bhattacherjee. At an event in December, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar said there are a lot of challenges in providing dual citizenship to Indians settled abroad. He pointed out that the Overseas Citizenship of India drive is a step towards meeting the demand. But he added that the debate on dual citizenship is still alive. In this context, we are discussing today, should India allow dual citizenship? Joining me on this conversation are veteran diplomat Ambassador Vivek Katju and Professor Amitabh Mattoo, Dean of the School of International Studies in the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Ambassador Katju and Professor Mattoo, welcome to the Parley podcast of The Hindu. I would ask you first, Ambassador Katju, about the remark from the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, where he said that the dual citizenship issue is still alive. Do you think we are at some point in near future going to consider granting dual citizenship to Indian citizens living abroad or NRIs living abroad? Do you think it is going to be in the national interest, or do you think it is a process that needs to be carefully thought out and there should be a national debate about this matter?
Kallol, thank you for inviting me to your podcast. First, let me distinguish between NRIs living abroad and those who are people of Indian origin. NRIs are non-resident Indians. They hold Indian passports. They are Indian nationals. So they have all the rights which accrue to Indian nationals. The only thing that they are not able to exercise abroad is while they are abroad, is their right to cast a vote. Though I believe arrangements were made at some stage for NRIs to register themselves in the missions so that they could cast a vote in their normal place of residence in India. People of Indian origin are not Indian nationals, quite clearly, and therefore they do not have political rights. At one stage, the government had given expanded economic facilities to people of Indian origin, and at a later stage, what was called a PIO card, that means a person of Indian origin card, was converted into an Overseas Citizen of India card. Now, I, for one, never understood the reason for this change in designation, or because the OIC card does not confer on an person of Indian origin any additional facilities or any additional rights which the PIO card did not already possess. And I felt that citizenship, and I will bow to Professor Mattoo on this, because I think as an academic, his knowledge of these affairs is far more than mine. But citizenship is essentially has political attributes. If you are a citizen, you have the full right to participate in the political process of a country. A non-citizen does not have that right. So the word citizen is extremely confusing. And to me, it should be avoided, because it creates an impression which is totally misleading.
But Professor Mattoo, when we hear Ambassador Katju's remarks, what comes to our mind is that though the minister has said that the issue is open or alive, there are obviously quite a few unresolved areas in this debate. What are your thoughts about granting of dual citizenship rights for people of Indian origin living abroad?
Thank you, Kallol, for inviting me to this podcast. And Ambassador Katju, in his usual erudite self, has fleshed out the main contours of the debate. Let me begin by saying that I think the External Affairs Minister Mr. Jaishankar must have made a off-the-cuff remark. It cannot be a serious question to be debated at this point of time in India that certain people who have a class of people who are no longer Indian citizens, who either have given up Indian citizenship or never were Indian citizens, will be given an additional citizenship of India. Now, if you look back at the Constitution of India, Part 2 of the Constitution deals with the section on citizenship. Now, Article 5 of the Constitution of India defines who is a citizen of India by either birth or by parentage or by acquiring after having remained resident in India. And there also, of course, a distinction in between being a domicile and being a citizen. So you may be domiciled in India and yet not be citizen. This is a case which was fought between in 1955 itself when the Citizenship Act came into being. The only major amendment to the Citizenship Act came in 2019 when there was a fast-track process for minorities from certain neighborhood countries to be allowed to take Indian citizenship. I don't think it can really be a serious substantive question that people are allowed to have citizenship of another country and of India, because that would confer political rights. In other words, that those citizens of, say, United States or United Kingdom or Australia would not just have political loyalty to the United States, United Kingdom and Australia, but also have the right to vote to India. That, frankly, for me, is an extremely dangerous idea. I would not, as an Indian citizen, as a citizen of Bharat Mata, Free India, Republic of India, and whose ancestors fought for India's freedom, be willing to give the political rights to anyone who has divided loyalties. Because, after all, dual citizenship means that you have divided loyalties. What? For reasons of instrumentalities, for transactional reasons, for providing ease of access for travel, investment, and for people who want to have a longer stay, you have, as Ambassador Katju said, provision initially of PIO with limited rights. For 15 years, you could live in India without requiring a visa. That OCI has now changed it to a lifelong visa to stay in India, to acquire property in India, to do almost everything except vote in elections, and except perhaps except to acquire agricultural land, because land alienation has always been a sensitive issue, agricultural land in India, and not travel to the border areas. And even that, with, I think, inner line permit and other permissions, you can travel to some of the border areas as well. So frankly, I would think that this debate, if Minister Jaishankar really wanted to provoke a debate, it might be premature. We are not ready to have dual citizenship in this country after just 75 years. And knowing, I'm not xenophobic. I'm a person who has grown up with an idea of global citizenship in a larger sense. But in terms of which political dispensation will rule India, will govern India, I'm not willing to share that right with anyone who has but 100% political loyalty to India. Personally, I have had the option of acquiring an Australian citizenship. And only one reason why I did not acquire it, because that would mean relinquishing Indian citizenship. I'm a stakeholder in this country's future. I believe in this country's future, and I would not let that loyalty to India be diluted by my political loyalties elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Professor Mattoo. Ambassador Katju, I wanted to just take a broader look at the issue. For example, let us look at the United States and the composition of the incoming Trump presidency, where several Indian origin people, as well as first-generation Indian immigrants, also have found space. And they are obviously going to hold public offices. They are going to be held accountable for their work. And these are people who have been in the United States barely for 15 to 20 years. Now, there are also other democracies, for example, Israel, and also near home, say Pakistan and Bangladesh, we find people with dual citizenship playing public roles, holding public offices, becoming members of commissions and other such public institutions. Now, the question is, as we take this position that one should be cautious and India is not yet ready for dual citizenship, is there in some ways that we are perhaps looking at the matter in a more orthodox manner, and while other democracies are really moving ahead and are becoming slightly more flexible when it comes to the idea of citizenship? Or is there a kind of, if I can say so, there are also people who travel continuously, like the IT workers and, IT engineers. They have constantly global travel plans on their calendar. So do you think that for the sake of certain communities and certain kinds of workers who are employable globally, perhaps the idea of citizenship requires some bit of flexibility?
No, I don't. I entirely agree with Professor Mattoo. You can't have divided loyalties. You are either a citizen of India,
Right,
possessing full rights, political rights, economic rights, etc., or you are not. For me personally, this is a water and ice situation. You mentioned that in the United States, there are people of Indian origin who are who have and who will be holding high office. I think 6 persons of Indian origin have been elected to the House of Representatives on this time.
right.
But let us not forget that they are American citizens.
Yeah, but there is also an Indian who went there just 20 years ago who is also becoming a tech advisor.
The question is, what is his nationality? India, the Indian system and the Indian law demands that the moment you acquire the nationality of another country, you relinquish India's nationality, which means that you do not have political rights anymore. It is not a question of your being there 20 years or 2 years or 2 months.
Right.
It is the right of every Indian, I believe, the democratic right of every Indian to choose the citizenship of another country and relinquish Indian citizenship. That is his right. But he cannot say that I will relinquish, that I will acquire a citizenship of another country and be part of the political process of that country, have political rights in that country, and at the same time, I want to hold on to political rights in India. Now, I know, as you have said, that some countries accept that. But I must confess, I have very orthodox views on this. Right. The international system is a system of states. And to me, to have divided loyalty is not acceptable. I think as a person is put in an impossible situation, to my mind, my way of thinking, if his loyalties are divided between 2 or more than 2 states. So, if I may give you an analogy, it's like a person who accepts an adoption in another family. The Hindu law of adoption allows that, for instance. But once you are adopted by another family and you accept that adoption, then you sever all connections with your natural family. And the only connection that remains is that when it comes to marriage, then the prohibited degrees of your natural family and your adopted family apply. Otherwise, the connection is severed totally. And that is correct. Because again, it's a question of divided loyalties. But you can't have your feet in 2 camps at the same time. And when you say that for the convenience of certain class of Indian citizens, for their employment, etc., that we should change basic principles on which our polity is based, does not appeal to me.
Professor Katju, if you could also share some of your thoughts on that question.
I completely and totally endorse Ambassador Katju's remarks. His ancestors and my ancestors have fought for India's freedom, and we have a united stake, as have millions of other Indians, in the future of this country. We cannot, for the sake of populism or attracting foreign investment, create a comprador, what the Marxists used to call a comprador class, a class of people who are really foreign agents, who will act as foreign agents in India. You give them a right to vote and to elect members of parliament, members of legislative assembly. That is a sure way of recolonizing India. I'm sorry, I have very strong views on this. It is not to say
No, sure, please. You're welcome.
it is not saying that you should not create greater convenient mechanisms to ease travel, to
Right.
provide more benefits to those who invest in India. Fair enough. I mean,
Right.
have more immigration counters, have special counters for those who are OCI card holders, but to give them political rights is really, frankly, fundamentally questioning the ethos of India, the idea of India, and would lead to potentially, and let me not, and you it may sound like an exaggeration, potentially to the balkanization of India if you allow citizens of another country, of many other countries.
Yes.
Okay, now the knee-jerk reaction is we'll not include people from the neighborhood. But if we open this Pandora's box of allowing even one single citizen of any other country to have a dual citizenship of India, it's deeply dangerous and subversive. Now, there are situations where people who have decided to make India their home have relinquished earlier citizenship and become citizens of India. Meera Alpasa, the mother, whose work inspires many of us, who helped found the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Puducherry. Even
Right.
Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, she relinquished her Italian citizenship and became a citizen of India. Or the economist John Rees, who I believe has relinquished his European Belgian citizenship and become a citizen. Fair enough. You believe in India, you want to live in India, you're committed to India's ideals, you are committed to India's future, you give up your previous citizenship. That's fairly, that's completely acceptable, as is acceptable that Vivek Ramaswamy goes to the United States, acquires American citizenship, and then or is born American and then even becomes a candidate for the presidency, or Mr. Patel, who's now a candidate for the FBI directorship. These are not dual citizens. In fact, the United States of America might seem much more flexible. The fact is that you cannot become a president of the United States of America unless you're born the territory of the United States of America. That's why Elon Musk, for all his championing of Trump, can never aspire to be president because he was born in South Africa. So some of these laws are much more rigid. I think we should be careful for sparking a debate prematurely on an issue which really, frankly speaking to me, does not have substantive merit in either law or the Indian ethos.
Professor Mattoo, since you mentioned it, and I actually wanted to ask this question to both of you, but I would ask you first because you mentioned the issue of populism. We have seen over the last 1 decade or so our Prime Minister traveling to various parts of the world. Wherever he goes, he attends these conclaves and rallies and community events where people of Indian origin as well as Indian citizens living in those countries, converge and they interact with the Prime Minister. Obviously, it shows that the Indian leadership is popular abroad among Indian communities or Indian citizens of that country, Indian origin citizens of that country. The question is, at some point, since political populism is also a factor in this debate, understandably so. Is this debate also being generated to meet certain political goals, Professor Katju? Professor Mattoo, my apologies.
I hope not, because I have great respect and regard for the External Affairs Minister. So I don't hope not that he's not doing it for purely populist reasons, because I think the diaspora has a role to play. You have the diaspora having played a great role in cementing bilateral relations with the United States. You have a hugely successful Indian diaspora in the US, which often acts as a rallying point for leaders' visits there. And similarly, in other countries of the world, of course, there are diasporas and diasporas. The first diaspora was of indentured labor that went into the Caribbean as really bonded labor. So that has not been as successful in material terms as this new wave of diaspora. But diaspora, as I said, can cement bilateral relations. It can help attract investment from abroad. I mean, people like, in the case of Microsoft, Satya Nadella has promised $3 billion of investment in artificial intelligence. That's fantastic. I mean, that's all for the good. The question really is whether this diaspora then becomes a Frankenstein monster, which means that while you think that this, in its benign role, it is a source of great good, but you suddenly empower it to the point where they decide who's going to be your next leader. That is where I think that there has to be a Lakshman Rekha. You have to have that boundary between a legitimate, useful role played by the diaspora, and then the diaspora crossing the diaspora and that demarcation and boundary and that Lakshman Rekha, and then suddenly deciding your future. I am not willing to let any Satya Nadella or Vivek Ramaswamy or any person of Indian origin also, forget those who may just acquire Indian citizenship because they say they believe in India while retaining their American or other citizenship. I'm not willing to let any of them decide my political future. I am an Indian citizen. I vote for my future along with other Indian citizens, and those who do not have any other loyalties to any other country.
Ambassador Katju, of course, Professor Mattoo mentioned the issue of populism, and he said that, of course, for External Affairs Minister Jaishankar may not have such an intention, but when it comes to appealing to NRIs living abroad or appealing to Indian origin people abroad. Now we have the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas going on here. The government of India, awards these sammans every year to the people of Indian origin and honors their successes. The Ambassador Katju, is there a populist angle to this debate, and what are the perils of going into such a debate under the influence of populism, Ambassador Katju?
Look, let me go to basics as I tried right at the beginning. There's a fundamental difference between NRIs and PIOs. We tend to confuse the two. We can't, and we should not.
Right, sir.
There can be people who are non-resident Indians, for example, who are in the Gulf, who spend their entire lives as non-resident Indians, and they live in the Gulf. And you can honor them, you can honor their contribution, you can honor what they do for India. That is perfectly fine. Now, when it comes to people of Indian origin, the fact is that, and I'm treading on a little slippery ground, but let me make that effort too. It has been seen that that Prime Minister Modi is very popular among sections of people of Indian origin in certain democratic countries. And when local leaders see that the Prime Minister of India is very popular among their sections of their electorate, they naturally try to use Mr. Modi's popularity for their own electoral purposes. I think diplomatically, we've got to be very, very careful in ensuring that this is not so. Because ultimately, it can be counterproductive for our interests. There's another aspect. Yes. In the early years of our independence, when the diaspora was essentially consisted of descendants of what Professor Mattoo mentioned, Indian indentured labor, I think Jawaharlal Nehru was very conscious to promote the idea among them that their loyalty should be, political loyalty should be to the country where they lived if they decided to continue to live there and acquire its citizenship. This was during the period of decolonization. They could have cultural connections with India, and we promoted those. Because there is an aspect of roots, and you want a connection with your roots. But he didn't want, and I think very wisely, he did not want that such persons who had chosen, for example, to live in Malaysia, or to live in Guyana, or to live in some, say, in African countries, or to live in Fiji, to be suspect in the eyes of the original inhabitants of that country. So his advice to them was that you've chosen to be citizens of this country, and your loyalty, political loyalty, should be to the country where you are, whose citizenship you have acquired, whereas your cultural roots you should nourish. So there was a distinction between culture and political right. And there was one other aspect. I think India has at all times, and I know this for a fact because of my service in Fiji after the first coup staged by Rambuka, who was then the coup maker and who's now, I believe, the Prime Minister of Fiji, that India always raised its voice to demand equality for people of Indian origin wherever they were. That was perfectly in keeping with international practice. So if there was political discrimination against them, if there was any persecution of such people of Indian origin, we never hesitated to raise the issue and raise it forcefully. In Fiji, I know we did so starting from 1987. So this is a very complex thing. Unfortunately, there are sections of opinion here who want to create illusions. And the word OCI to me really is an aspect of creating that illusion. Citizenship is a political thing. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I think it bears repetition, and I'm confident that Professor Mattoo would agree with me. Citizenship is intimately connected with political rights. So when you say an overseas citizen of India, you are really talking, it's a term which is absurd. Because citizenship means political rights. And you can't give political rights. And I do not think this country will ever agree to allowing dual citizenship. Because it is part of our ethos that you are a patriot, and if you are, and therefore you are part of this country, which does not mean that democratically you can choose to give up your citizenship and become part of another country. That's perfectly valid. Just as I told you, a child can be adopted or a person can be adopted by another family. It's a perfectly valid thing. But then you can't have your feet in both camps, so to say. You can't have divided loyalties.
Right. My last question, and I would request both the speakers to limit it within 1.5 minutes if possible. Sir, we all saw that on 17 September 2022, there were riots in the city of Leicester in the United Kingdom, where the Hindus and Muslims of citizens of the United Kingdom, they clashed with each other. I'm going to ask you this, that is there a possibility that when we talk about granting citizenship, when some people talk about granting citizenship rights to people of Indian origin abroad, is there a possibility that some of the some of the live debates that take place in India, especially on the political platforms, could actually also get replicated in those countries, and the countries in those parts of the world actually could get affected by whatever takes place on the Indian political platform. That is also a danger for them. Is there such a possibility, Professor Mattoo, if you could talk about that a bit?
See, there is always diasporas are a complicated entity. There is no one united diaspora as far as India is concerned. But diasporas always go through these various phases of remaining in some ways tied emotionally to the country of origin while living and working in the host country. Norman Tebbit, the British politician, once said the cricket test should be mandatory. Who will the Indian team or the Pakistani team support during a cricket match at the Lords between the British team and the English team and the Indian team, say? And if they fail the Tebbit test or the cricket test, then they are not really citizens of the crown. But that is neither here nor there. We all know that emotions cannot be in some ways circumscribed by laws and regulations. So people will be impacted whether they live in Leicester or Coventry or whether they live in New York by happenings in India. And in the days of live media, cable television, social media, you cannot beyond a point regulate this. I mean, in an ideal world, you would like a civilized, perfect discourse happening, people living in perfect harmony. And indeed, that was the case where before cable television invaded us. In Oxford, when I was a student there, Indians and Pakistanis were part of a same organization called the Majlis, for instance, students, and often used to have a common stand on most anti-colonial issues, break bread with each other, have a common position on many world affairs. But that has changed as the world has changed. But as I said, the distance between trying to have a more restrained diaspora and offering them dual citizenship is a huge distance. In fact, if you remember, if you look at the history of the diaspora, and since Ambassador Katju has served in Fiji, he'll be able to flesh this out. The initial wave of diaspora to Fiji were the Girmatiyas, who came under an agreement that they would serve as indentured labor for 5 years and then return to India at their own cost, or I think after 10 years at the Crown's cost. But they were left in terrible conditions. If there was a case to be made for granting citizenship in the 19th or the early years of the independence, it would have been to the Girmatiyas. But even there, I would never agree to a dual citizenship. So these are phases that diasporas go through. Many responses are emotional. Many responses become more rational, more investment-oriented. And the Chinese often mobilize their diaspora. The Ukrainian diaspora is so powerful that often people say that American foreign policy towards Ukraine is created by the Ukrainian diaspora. The Jewish lobby is well known. So these are lobbies which have existed, and these lobbies can often have a multiplier impact in terms of your foreign policy, properly harnessed, properly channelized. But do not promise them the moon, because that is dangerous. To give them an illusion of heaven, in Urdu they say surkhab ke par. I mean, to give that kind of illusion that there is some fruit hanging if you constantly act as our force multipliers, I think that is dangerous, because they have to be ultimately loyal to the citizens, loyal to the countries of their present citizenship, which they have voluntarily acquired. There was no force, no coercion by India to any citizen or to any Indian citizen to give up their citizenship. Only when you acquired your foreign citizenship did you have to relinquish your Indian citizenship. So that it's important that they remain your best instrument, your best foreign policy tool, when they're seen as responsible members of that country. Responsible, responsive to Indian concern, but primarily law-abiding, responsible citizens of the United States, United Kingdom, and every country in which India has a presence. That should be our ambition. Beyond that, to have ambitions of a larger diasporic community which has been granted citizenship is, I think, dangerous.
Thank you so much, Professor Mattoo. This has been brilliant. Ambassador Katju, thank you so much. Professor Mattoo, thank you so much for joining the Hindus podcast. We hope to see you soon.